Preston poured a glass of vintage champagne, handing it to the young blonde wrapped around his arm as they stepped into the cavernous foyer of the $8 million Hawthorne estate. This was it, the ultimate betrayal, wrapped in imported Italian marble and dripping with crystal chandeliers. He was going to buy this sprawling mansion, move his mistress into the master suite, and serve his brilliant, unsuspecting wife of 10 years divorce papers the very next morning. It was a ruthless, perfectly executed plan. But as Preston smugly reached for the finalized property deed resting on the mahogany kitchen island, his victorious smile froze. The name printed boldly under sole owner wasn't his. It was his wife's. To the outside world, Preston and Camille Sterling were the picture of modern, unassailable success. Preston, with his sharp jawline, tailored Tom Ford suits, and effortless New England pedigree, was a senior partner at a boutique private equity firm in Manhattan. Camille, a striking, dark-skinned black woman with cheekbones that could cut glass and a quiet, terrifying intellect, ran her own highly exclusive architectural design and urban planning firm. They had met a decade ago at a charity gala in Chicago. Preston had been captivated by her commanding presence, the way she held a room without ever raising her voice. Camille had been charmed by his relentless drive. But 10 years is a long time in a marriage built on a foundation of unspoken competition, and over the past 3 years, the rot had begun to set in. Preston's ego had outgrown their partnership. As his firm landed a string of lucrative acquisitions, his bonuses swelled, and so did his resentment. He began to feel overshadowed by Camille's silent, effortless wealth. Camille came from a prominent family of black entrepreneurs in Atlanta. She didn't just earn money, she understood how to multiply it invisibly. While Preston boasted about his 7-figure salary at dinner parties, Camille quietly acquired commercial real estate under a labyrinth of holding companies. Preston didn't know the true extent of his wife's net worth, and in his arrogance, he assumed he was the undeniable king of their castle. Enter Chloe Harrington. Chloe was 24, a junior publicist at a lifestyle brand, with ash blonde extensions, a curated Instagram feed, and a bottomless appetite for the kind of luxury she couldn't afford. Preston had met her at a corporate retreat in Aspen, where Camille challenged him. Chloe worshipped him. Where Camille saw right through his bluster to the insecurities underneath, Chloe hung on his every word as if he were a titan of industry. The affair had been going on for 8 months. What started as a predictable midlife cliché in luxury hotel rooms had rapidly mutated into a delusion of grandeur. Preston was completely infatuated, not just with Chloe, but with the version of himself he was when he was with her, a master of the universe, unburdened by a wife who was his intellectual equal. "I'm getting out, Chloe," Preston had murmured to her one rainy Tuesday afternoon, tangled in the high thread-count sheets of a suite at the plaza. "I'm tired of the coldness. I'm tired of Camille acting like she runs my life. I'm going to leave her." Chloe had traced his jawline, her eyes gleaming with calculated innocence. "But what about a house, baby? We can't stay in hotels forever. I want a home with you. Something big. Something ours." That was the catalyst. Preston decided he wasn't just going to divorce Camille. He was going to humiliate her. He was going to execute a financial maneuver so brilliant, so stealthy, that she would be completely blindsided. For months, Preston meticulously siphoned funds from their joint brokerage accounts, funneling them into an offshore LLC he named Apex Holdings. He was careful, moving amounts just under the threshold that would trigger an alert from their primary wealth manager, David Caldwell. Preston's plan was to use Apex Holdings to purchase the Hawthorne estate, a legendary, sweeping property nestled in the hills of Greenwich, Connecticut, a place Camille had once casually mentioned she admired but deemed too ostentatious for their current portfolio. Preston wanted ostentatious. He wanted to strip away half of their liquid assets, buy the estate in cash through the LLC, and move Chloe in. Then, safely entrenched in his new fortress of wealth, he would drop the divorce papers on Camille's lap. He imagined her shock, her sudden realization that she had underestimated him, that he had outmaneuvered her completely. He spent the weeks leading up to the closing completely high on his own deceit. He smiled warmly at Camille over morning coffee in their Upper East Side penthouse, kissing her cheek before leaving for the office, entirely unaware of the subtle, imperceptible sharpening in his wife's dark eyes. Camille never missed a detail, not a stray receipt, not a shift in his routine, and certainly not a discrepancy in their financial statements. "You've been in a remarkably good mood lately, Preston," Camille noted one evening, elegantly slicing into her duck confit. She wore a simple silk emerald blouse, her natural hair pulled back into a flawless chignon. Preston chuckled, sipping his Cabernet. "Just closing some major deals at the firm, darling. Big things on the horizon. I feel like this is going to be a transformative year for me." "I have no doubt it will be," Camille replied, her voice smooth, her expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She took a delicate sip of her water. "Transformative is exactly the word I would use." Preston grinned, oblivious. He was a man constructing a house of cards, utterly unaware that his wife controlled the wind. The drive up to Greenwich on that crisp Tuesday morning felt like a victory lap. Preston gripped the leather steering wheel of his Porsche Panamera, a smug, permanent smile plastered across his face. Beside him, Chloe was buzzing with manic energy, a pair of oversized Celine sunglasses perched on her head, her manicured fingers tapping rapidly on her phone. "I still can't believe it," Chloe squealed, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "An $8 million estate, Preston. You're actually doing it. You're incredible." "Only the best for us, babe," Preston said smoothly, shifting gears as they merged onto the highway. "The broker, Richard Hayes, is meeting us there with the final physical documents. The wire transfers cleared this morning from the LLC. The moment I sign the final deed acknowledgement, I get the keys. And tomorrow morning, Camille gets the papers." "Do you think she'll fight you for it?" Chloe asked, a brief flash of genuine worry crossing her heavily contoured face. Preston laughed, a rich, arrogant sound. "Fight me with what? The property is shielded behind a blind trust tied to Apex Holdings. Even her fancy lawyers won't be able to untangle it before the divorce is finalized. Besides, she's too proud to cause a messy public scene. She'll take the settlement I offer and quietly fade away." They turned off the main road, winding through dense, manicured forests, before arriving at a massive set of wrought iron gates. The brass plaque on the stone pillar read, "The Hawthorne Estate." Preston rolled down the window and punched a temporary code into the keypad. The heavy gates swung open silently, revealing a sweeping, quarter-mile-long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. At the end of the drive sat the house. It was breathtaking. A 12,000-square-foot neoclassical masterpiece built of white limestone, featuring soaring columns, a slate roof, and immaculate terraced gardens that cascaded down toward a private infinity pool. It reeked of old money, power, and untouchable status. "Oh my God," Chloe breathed, practically pressing her face against the passenger window. "Preston, it's a palace." "It's our palace," he corrected, putting the car in park on the circular cobblestone driveway. Waiting for them at the top of the grand sweeping staircase was Richard Hayes, the senior broker for Sotheby's International Realty. Richard was an older gentleman, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio. However, as Preston and Chloe approached, hand in hand, Richard's expression was strangely tight. He didn't have the broad, sycophantic smile of a broker who had just closed an $8 million cash deal. He looked uncomfortable. "Richard, good to see you," Preston boomed, extending a confident hand. Richard shook it briefly. "Mr. Sterling. And Miss Harrington, I presume?" "Yes, nice to meet you," Chloe said, already looking past him at the massive double oak doors. "Can we go inside? I need to figure out where the interior decorators should start." "Of course. Please come in," Richard said, pushing open the heavy doors. The foyer was a cathedral of luxury. A double-sweeping staircase framed a massive crystal chandelier that hung from a domed ceiling 30 feet above. The floors were slabs of seamless Calcutta marble. Chloe immediately began spinning around the room, echoing her excitement into the cavernous space. "The master suite is upstairs, South Wing," Preston told her, tossing his coat onto a nearby chair. "Go take a look. I'm going to finish the paperwork with Richard down here." Chloe shrieked in delight and went practically sprinting up the marble stairs, the sharp clacking of her Louboutins echoing through the empty mansion. Preston turned back to Richard, rubbing his hands together. "All right, Richard, let's get this done. You have the final deed of trust. I know the wire cleared." "The funds did indeed clear, Mr. Sterling," Richard said slowly, walking toward the massive mahogany kitchen island that sat in the center of the chef's kitchen, just off the foyer. He placed the leather portfolio down carefully. However, there is a slight irregularity with the closing documents. Preston frowned, stepping up to the island. "Irregularity? What do you mean?" "Apex Holdings was fully funded. My lawyers reviewed the draft last week. It's a standard cash acquisition." "Yes, well," Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He seemed to be actively avoiding Preston's gaze. "The acquisition was indeed processed through Apex Holdings, LLC. But it appears there was a misunderstanding on your part regarding the corporate structure of the LLC." Preston's heart gave a strange, singular thud. "Misunderstanding? I formed the LLC myself. I am the sole managing member." "Actually, sir," Richard said, finally looking up, his eyes a mix of professional detachment and profound pity. "You are listed as an authorized signatory, but the parent company of Apex Holdings, LLC, the entity that actually holds the controlling shares and provided the baseline capitalization, was legally restructured 30 days ago during a routine portfolio consolidation by your primary wealth management firm." Preston felt the blood begin to drain from his face. The ambient chill of the air-conditioned mansion suddenly felt freezing. "What the hell are you talking about? David Caldwell manages those accounts. He wouldn't restructure my private LLC without my explicit authorization. I believe Mr. Caldwell was acting under the direct, overriding authorization of the primary account holder, sir." Richard opened the leather portfolio. He flipped past the thick stack of legalese, the title insurance, and the land surveys, stopping at the final, notarized property deed. The thick, creamy parchment was stamped with the official seal of the state of Connecticut. "The seller has signed. The transaction is complete. The property is legally recorded as of 9 a.m. this morning," Richard stated quietly. He spun the portfolio around so it faced Preston. Preston looked down. His vision seemed to swim for a second before the heavy black ink came into sharp focus. Under the section labeled Grantee Buyer, there was no mention of Apex Holdings. There was no mention of Preston Sterling. The document read, "In undeniable, legally binding print, sole and separate property of Camille Montgomery Sterling." Preston stared at the name. The letters seemed to burn into his retinas. Camille. No, Preston whispered, his voice cracking. He snatched the document from the folder, holding it up as if changing the angle would change the words. No, this is a mistake. This is fraud. I transferred the money. It was my money. It was joint marital funds, Mr. Sterling, Richard corrected gently, taking a small step back. And according to the documents provided by your wife's legal team this morning, since the LLC was funded from accounts primarily anchored by her pre-existing real estate trusts, she exercised her right as the majority stakeholder to bypass the shell company and put the title directly into her name. Legally, she bought the house with her own money. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Chloe came bouncing back into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement. Preston, the master bathroom has a soaking tub that looks out over the entire valley. It's perfect. Have you signed it? Are we officially owners? Preston couldn't speak. He stood frozen in the magnificent kitchen he had bought to orchestrate his wife's destruction, holding a piece of paper that proved his wife had just orchestrated his. Before Chloe could ask what was wrong, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room, Preston watched in absolute horror as a sleek, black Maybach pulled up behind his Porsche. The rear door opened, and a chauffeur stepped out, holding an umbrella. A moment later, Camille stepped out into the Connecticut sunlight. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored cream trench coat and wide-leg trousers, looking like the absolute master of her domain. She didn't look angry. She didn't look betrayed. She looked deeply, terrifyingly amused. Camille's entrance was a masterclass in silent intimidation. She didn't storm through the massive oak doors. She glided, the hem of her cream trench coat barely whispering against the Calcutta marble. Behind her, the chauffeur quietly pulled the door shut, sealing the three of them, Preston, Camille, and the terrified broker Richard, inside the cavernous foyer. Preston stood paralyzed by the kitchen island. His mind, usually sharp and quick to calculate risk, was flatlining. The deed of trust, with Camille's name glaring up at him, felt like a lead weight in his hand. "Good morning, Richard," Camille said warmly, her rich, melodic voice echoing off the domed ceiling. She didn't even look at her husband yet. "I hope the closing went smoothly. I apologize for my slight delay. Traffic on the Merritt Parkway was dreadful." "Mrs. Montgomery Sterling," Richard stammered, offering a stiff, deferential bow. "Yes, everything is in order. The transaction is complete." "Excellent. You've been immensely helpful, Richard. Your commission has already been wired from my private accounts. You may leave us now." Richard looked like a man who had just been granted a pardon from the governor. He hastily packed his leather portfolio, gave Preston one last, pitying glance, and practically sprinted for the side exit. The heavy silence that descended upon the Hawthorne estate was suffocating. Camille finally turned her gaze to Preston. Her dark eyes were pools of absolute, terrifying calm. There was no rage. There were no tears. There was only the clinical detachment of an architect inspecting a building she was about to demolish. "What is this, Camille?" Preston finally choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp. He held up the deed, his hand trembling slightly. "What did you do?" "I bought a house, Preston," she replied smoothly, slowly unbuttoning her coat. "Or rather, I finalized the purchase of a house using the capital you so graciously transferred into a subsidiary of my family's master trust. I must say, your taste has improved. It's a bit gaudy, but the foundation is solid. It was my money. Apex Holdings is my LLC." Preston's voice cracked, ascending into an undignified shout. The carefully constructed facade of the New England patrician was shattering. Camille offered a small, chilling smile. She walked toward the kitchen island, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Preston, darling, you are a senior partner in private equity, yet you possess a remarkably juvenile understanding of corporate structures. When we married, you insisted on keeping our primary brokerage accounts at Caldwell Financial under David Caldwell's supervision. A sensible choice." She paused, tracing a manicured finger over the cold marble countertop. "What you failed to realize, or perhaps chose to ignore in your arrogance, is that the Montgomery family has been David Caldwell's largest client for 3 generations. My grandfather built the firm's Atlanta branch. When you began siphoning marital funds into a new LLC, David's fiduciary duty triggered a mandatory review. He flagged the anomalous transfers 36 hours after you initiated them." Preston felt the blood drain from his head. He gripped the edge of the counter to keep from swaying. "David told you." "David didn't have to tell me," Camille corrected softly. "My personal wealth managers noticed that Apex Holdings was formed using an IP address tied to our home network and funded by joint liquid assets. You tried to build a financial fortress, Preston, but you built it on my land. Under Connecticut state law and the ironclad clauses of our prenuptial agreement, which you so eagerly signed to protect your future earnings, any shell company funded by commingled assets defaults to the majority stakeholder of the parent trust if fraudulent concealment is detected." She stepped closer, the scent of her signature Tom Ford black orchid perfume wrapping around him like a velvet noose. "You tried to steal from me to buy a love nest. I simply corrected the paperwork." "Preston, what's going on down here?" The high-pitched, breathless voice floated down from the grand staircase. Chloe appeared on the landing, her Celine sunglasses still perched on her blonde head. She froze, her eyes darting between Preston's pale, sweat-sheened face and the striking, elegant black woman standing casually in the center of the room. Camille turned. Her gaze swept over Chloe, taking in the designer labels, the heavy contouring, and the palpable desperation radiating from the younger woman. Camille didn't sneer. She didn't shout. Her expression softened into something far worse. Genuine, withering pity. "You must be Chloe," Camille said, her tone conversational. "The junior publicist from the Aspen retreat. I'm Camille, the wife." Chloe gripped the marble banister, her knuckles turning white. She looked at Preston for salvation, for the powerful titan of industry she thought she was dating. But Preston was looking at the floor, utterly emasculated. "I thought," Chloe stammered, her meticulously curated confidence evaporating. "You thought he was buying you a mansion?" Camille finished for her, nodding thoughtfully. "It's a common misconception. Preston excels at making promises he lacks the capital to keep. I hope you enjoyed the tour, Chloe. The master suite truly is spectacular. Unfortunately, my interior designers are arriving in 20 minutes, and I strictly enforce a closed-set policy during renovations." It was a dismissal of catastrophic proportions. Chloe's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked at Preston one last time, waiting for him to defend her, to fight for their palace. "Preston," Chloe whispered. Preston couldn't meet her eyes. "Go wait in the car, Chloe." Chloe let out a humiliated, choked sound. She practically flew down the rest of the stairs, her heels clicking frantically, and bolted out the front door. Once the door clicked shut, Camille picked up the deed from the counter, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her designer handbag. "I'll be moving my things here by the end of the week. You have until Friday to clear your belongings out of the Upper East Side penthouse. The locks will be changed at noon." Preston's head snapped up, rage finally piercing through the shock. "You can't do that. The penthouse is half mine." "Is it?" Camille asked, raising a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You might want to call Harrison Gable. I believe your lawyers have been trying to reach you all morning. Checkmate, Preston. Please see yourself out. You're tracking dirt onto my floors." The drive back to Manhattan was a suffocating nightmare. Preston sat behind the wheel of the Porsche, his hands gripping the leather so tightly his joints ached. Beside him, Chloe was curled into a tight ball, furiously texting on her phone, her silence a damning indictment of his failure. The manic energy and adulation she had showered him with just 2 hours prior were gone, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of a woman who had just realized she bet on the wrong horse. Preston barely noticed her. His mind was racing, trying to find a tactical advantage, a loophole, a way to spin this disaster. He pulled the car over onto the shoulder of the Hutchinson River Parkway, ignoring the blaring horns of passing cars, and grabbed his phone. He had 14 missed calls, 12 from his attorney, Harrison Gable, and 2 from Thomas Kensington, the senior managing partner at his private equity firm. Dread, cold and heavy, settled in his stomach. He dialed Harrison's number. It was picked up on the first ring. "Preston! Christ, where have you been?" Harrison's voice was uncharacteristically frantic. Harrison Gable was a shark, a high-priced divorce attorney who thrived on blood in the water. He didn't do frantic. "I was in Greenwich," Preston said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Harrison, Camille somehow intercepted the Hawthorne purchase. She hijacked Apex Holdings. She put the deed in her name." "I know, Preston." "I know," Harrison barked, the sound of rustling papers coming through the line. "That's the least of our problems right now." Preston felt his breath catch. "What do you mean, the least of our problems?" At 8 a.m. this morning, Camille's legal team, which, by the way, is led by Margaret Sterling Hayes from Vanguard and Pierce, a firm we cannot afford to go to war with, filed an ex parte motion in Manhattan Family Court. They accused you of fraudulent dissipation of marital assets. "It wasn't fraudulent," Preston yelled, hitting the steering wheel. "I moved liquid cash." "You moved $7 million of commingled funds into an offshore shell company while actively engaging in an extramarital affair. Preston, it is the textbook definition of asset dissipation in anticipation of divorce," Harrison shot back, his patience entirely evaporated. "The judge granted the motion an hour ago. Preston, your accounts are frozen. All of them." "What?" Preston whispered. The world outside the windshield seemed to tilt. "Your personal checking, the joint brokerage accounts, the Cayman offshore accounts you thought she didn't know about. They've all been locked pending a full forensic accounting audit. The only thing you have access to is your corporate expense account, and I strongly advise against using that for personal matters right now." "She can't freeze my money, Harrison. I have bills. I have—" Preston glanced at Chloe, who had stopped texting and was now staring at him, her eyes wide and predatory, listening to every word. "She didn't just freeze the money, Preston. She served the firm." "Served the firm with what?" Preston demanded, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. "Subpoenas. They are requesting every email, every financial disclosure, and every bonus projection from the last 5 years to prove you were actively hiding income. You need to get into the office and do damage control with Kensington right now. Camille isn't just divorcing you, Preston. She's financially executing you." The line went dead. Preston dropped the phone into his lap. He felt as though he was suffocating. He turned to look at Chloe, desperately seeking a modicum of comfort, a reminder of the powerful man he was supposed to be. Chloe was already gathering her designer bag. "Drop me off at the nearest Metro North station," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the sickly sweet pet names she usually used. "Chloe, baby, wait. This is just a setback. My lawyers will untangle this. I still have my position at the firm, my equity. You have frozen accounts and a wife who just played you like a cheap fiddle, Chloe interrupted, her tone sharp and surprisingly vicious. The illusion of the adoring ingenue dropped entirely. I wanted a lifestyle, Preston, not a legal battle. Take me to the train. An hour later, Preston walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Kensington, Ward and Associates in Midtown Manhattan. He felt like a ghost. He bypassed his assistant and walked straight toward the corner office of Thomas Kensington, the man who had mentored him for the past decade. Thomas was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, despite it only being 1 in the afternoon. "Thomas," Preston said, closing the heavy glass door behind him. "I can explain the subpoenas. My wife is acting erratically. It's a messy divorce proceeding, but I will keep it entirely separate from the firm's operations." Thomas turned around. He was a ruthless, pragmatic man, and right now he looked at Preston not as a protégé, but as a liability. "Have a seat, Preston," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Preston didn't sit. "Thomas, I assure you, Harrison Gable is handling the motion. It will be quashed by Friday." "Shut up and sit down," Thomas snapped, slamming the tumbler onto his mahogany desk. Preston flinched and slowly sank into the leather guest chair. "Do you know who owns the commercial lease to this building?" "Preston?" Thomas asked, leaning against his desk and crossing his arms. Preston blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in topic. "A corporate conglomerate. Archway Properties, I believe." "And do you know who sits on the board of Archway Properties, holding a controlling 51% stake through a maze of blind trusts?" Thomas asked, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. Preston's stomach dropped. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, locking together with terrifying precision. "No." "Your wife," Thomas said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Camille Montgomery Sterling. She doesn't just design buildings, Preston. She owns them." And at 9:30 this morning, Archway Properties informed our managing board that they will not be renewing our 10-year lease next month unless we agree to a 40% hike in rent. She can't do that," Preston stammered. "That's extortion. It's business," Thomas corrected harshly. "It's leverage." And she didn't stop there. "Two of our biggest institutional investors, funds tied heavily to the Montgomery family's philanthropic network in Atlanta, called me an hour ago. They are putting their capital commitments on pause, pending a review of our firm's ethical leadership." Thomas walked around the desk and looked down at Preston, a man who had spent 10 years believing he was the sun, only to realize he was merely a satellite orbiting a much larger, much more dangerous planet. "You brought your domestic mess into my boardroom, Preston. You underestimated the woman you married, and now she is holding a gun to the head of my firm. You are taking an immediate, indefinite leave of absence, effective right now. Surrender your keycard to security on the way out." Preston sat frozen in the chair, the reality of his total annihilation washing over him. In the span of 6 hours, he had lost his mistress, his multi-million-dollar estate, his penthouse, his liquid assets, and his career. He had walked into the Hawthorne mansion intending to destroy his wife. Instead, Camille had flawlessly, effortlessly, and legally erased him from the map. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, Preston Sterling was a man without a country. He stood on the bustling sidewalk outside the glass and steel monolith of Kensington Ward and Associates, clutching a cardboard box containing a few personal desk items, a Mont Blanc pen, a framed photo of his Yale rowing team, and a crystal paperweight. His chest was tight, his breathing shallow. The ambient noise of midtown Manhattan traffic felt deafening. For the first time in his adult life, Preston didn't know where to go. His instinct was to head to the Carlyle Hotel on Madison Avenue. He had practically lived in their Bemmelmann's bar during his late 20s, schmoozing clients over $30 martinis. He hailed a yellow cab, shoved his box onto the worn leather seat, and barked the address. When he arrived at the polished brass front desk, he handed the clerk his Chase Private Client Palladium card. "I need a suite. Open-ended stay," Preston said, attempting to project his usual aura of effortless authority. The clerk swiped the card. The machine beeped, a harsh, flat sound. The clerk frowned, tried the chip, and then looked up with a polite, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. The card is returning a code 04. Hold and call. It's been declined by the issuer." Preston's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. "That's impossible. Try my Platinum Amex." He slid the heavy metal card across the marble counter. Another swipe, another sharp beep. "Declined as well, sir. Would you like to try another form of payment?" Preston grabbed the cards, his hands shaking, and practically ran out of the lobby. Harrison Gable hadn't been exaggerating. Camille's legal team hadn't just frozen the massive brokerage accounts. They had obtained an emergency injunction on every single line of credit attached to his name, citing his massive, unauthorized withdrawal of $7 million as an immediate flight risk. Panic, cold and sharp, finally set in. He had exactly $300 in cash in his Tom Ford wallet. 4 hours later, Preston was sitting on the edge of a lumpy, polyester bed in a sterile, generic DoubleTree hotel room near LaGuardia Airport. He had paid for 2 nights in cash. The room smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale desperation. The roar of departing commercial jets rattled the cheap window panes every 10 minutes. It was a spectacular fall from the $8 million Hawthorne estate, and the whiplash was making him physically nauseous. His phone buzzed. It was Harrison. "I'm at a diner on 10th Avenue. Get down here," the lawyer ordered. He didn't sound like a man billing $1,500 an hour. He sounded like a man trying to sever a gangrenous limb. When Preston arrived at the greasy, neon-lit diner, Harrison was already sitting in a vinyl booth, nursing a black coffee. Spread across the Formica table were thick stacks of financial documents, stamped with the glaring red logo of FTI Consulting, one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms in the world. "What is all this?" Preston asked, sliding into the booth, eyeing the papers like they were venomous snakes. "This," Harrison said grimly, tapping the stack, "is your autopsy, Preston. Margaret Sterling Hayes sent over the preliminary discovery file an hour ago. Camille didn't just hire a divorce lawyer. She hired a mercenary squad. They have retained FTI Consulting to audit your entire digital and financial footprint for the last 36 months. 36 months? Why?" "Because," Harrison leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "they are building a case for gross marital misconduct, financial fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Look at this." Harrison slid a stapled packet across the table. Preston looked down. It was a meticulously organized dossier of his affair with Chloe. But it wasn't just hotel receipts, it was an itemized ledger. Every Uber ride to her apartment, every dinner at Cipriani, every piece of Cartier jewelry, the spa weekend in Aspen, all calculated with terrifying precision, cross-referenced with his credit card statements and corporate expense reports. "They have everything, Preston," Harrison continued relentlessly. "They even flagged that $15,000 Patek Philippe watch you bought her in December. You categorized it as a client retention gift on your corporate card. FT, I found the matching Instagram post of Chloe wearing it, time-stamped 3 days later. They have subpoenaed your firm's HR department to prove expense fraud. That's why Thomas Kensington suspended you today. It wasn't just the building lease. It was this. Preston felt all the air leave his lungs. Camille is destroying me. Over an affair? People have affairs every day, Harrison. It's New York. You don't annihilate a man's life over it. She isn't destroying you over the affair, you idiot, Harrison snapped, his patience entirely depleted. She's destroying you because you tried to steal her money to fund it. You insulted her intelligence. You are a white-collar executive who tried to out-finance a woman whose family practically owns the commercial grid of Atlanta. And worse, you got sloppy. Harrison packed up the files, his movements sharp and final. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase and pushed it toward Preston. "What is this?" Preston asked, staring at the document. "My invoice for services rendered to date, and a notice of withdrawal as your counsel," Harrison said coldly. "What? You can't drop me. I need you to fight this." "Fight it with what, Preston? You have no liquid assets, your credit is locked, and your career is dead. My firm requires a $100,000 retainer replenishment to proceed to litigation. Unless you have that in your pocket right now, we are done." Harrison stood up, tossing a $10 bill on the table for his coffee. He looked down at Preston, shaking his head. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Preston. I have never seen a man walk into a buzzsaw as perfectly as you did. I strongly advise you to sign whatever settlement they offer, because if you take this to court, she will ensure you leave in a barrel." Alone in his miserable airport hotel room, Preston stared at the digital clock on the bedside table. 2:14 a.m. He couldn't sleep. The silence of the room was suffocating, broken only by the sporadic roar of airplanes overhead. Spread across the cheap laminate desk were the few documents Harrison had left behind, mostly the discovery filings from Camille's legal team. Desperate for a loophole, a mistake, or any sign of a weakness, Preston began poring over the documents. He read through the forensic accounting summary, tracking the meticulous way FTI Consulting had unspooled his life. But as he flipped to the annex containing the restructuring details of the Montgomery Master Trust, the financial maneuver Camille had used to trap him at the Hawthorne estate, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a timestamp on the initial authorization form for the trust reorganization. October 14th. Preston stared at the date, his heart pounding a sickening rhythm against his ribs. October 14th. He scrambled for his phone, pulling up his calendar app, his thumb swiping frantically back through the months. He found the week in question. October 10th to 13th. Private Equity Leadership Summit, Aspen, Colorado. It was the trip where he had met Chloe. He had flown back to New York on the evening of the 13th. He remembered coming home to the penthouse, smelling faintly of Chloe's signature perfume, Le Labo Santal, 33. He remembered Camille greeting him in the foyer, kissing his cheek, and asking him how the mountain air was. He remembered feeling a thrill of illicit victory, convinced he had pulled it off without a hitch. The very next morning, October 14th, Camille had called her wealth manager in Atlanta and begun the 8-month process of legally restructuring her vast fortune to isolate and weaponize it against him. She had known from day one. Preston dropped the paper, his hands trembling violently. The sheer, sociopathic patience of it all terrified him. For 8 months, Camille had slept next to him, eaten breakfast with him, asked him about his day, and smiled at his arrogant boasts. For 8 months, she had watched him sneak around, watched him lie to her face, and never once raised her voice. Instead of throwing a plate, she had drawn up a blueprint. Preston realized with mounting horror that she hadn't just reacted to his theft of the $7 million. She had encouraged it. He remembered a conversation back in February, over dinner at Le Bernardin. He had complained about liquidity issues at the firm. Camille had casually mentioned that she had transferred a significant amount of cash from her real estate yields into their joint high-yield savings accounts, just in case he needed a buffer. She had bloated the joint accounts to tempt him. She knew he wanted to buy a property for Chloe. Chloe was loud, flashy, and predictable. Camille had laid the cheese in the mousetrap, and Preston had walked right in, thinking he was the smartest rat in the maze. By moving the money into Apex Holdings, he had committed the exact financial crime she needed to trigger the draconian penalty clauses in their prenuptial agreement. Suddenly, an email notification pinged on his laptop. It was from Margaret Sterling Hayes, Camille's lead attorney. The subject line read, "Final settlement offer and notice of federal inquiry." Preston clicked it open, his stomach in freefall. The settlement was brutally simple. Camille would assume total, undisputed ownership of the Hawthorne estate, the Upper East Side penthouse, and 100% of the marital liquid assets. Preston would walk away with his personal effects, the leased Porsche, which he could no longer afford the payments on, and whatever remained in his frozen personal checking account, roughly $14,000. In exchange, she would drop the civil suit for asset dissipation. He had 24 hours to sign. If he didn't, they would proceed to trial and seek to hold him liable for her attorney's fees, which were already cresting $500,000. But it was the second attachment that completely broke him. It was a copy of a suspicious activity report, SAR, filed directly with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a bureau of the United States Treasury. The document detailed the exact method Preston had used to siphon the $7 million into Apex Holdings. Because he had been afraid of triggering an internal audit at Caldwell Financial, Preston had broken the massive sum into multiple, smaller wire transfers over the course of 3 weeks. Several of those transfers were specifically engineered to fall just under the $10,000 threshold that normally triggers automatic IRS reporting. In the banking world, this illegal practice was called smurfing or structuring. It was a federal crime, often associated with money laundering and tax evasion. The FinCEN report hadn't been generated by an algorithm. It had been submitted anonymously by an informed third party. Camille. She hadn't just taken his money and his mistress. She had packaged his arrogant, sloppy financial maneuvering and gift-wrapped it for the federal government. The email from Margaret Sterling Hayes contained a polite, terrifyingly brief addendum. Please be advised that while my client is prepared to settle the civil dissolution of marriage under the attached terms, she cannot control the trajectory of any independent inquiries initiated by the Internal Revenue Service or the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the formation and funding of Apex Holdings LLC. We suggest you retain criminal defense counsel immediately. Preston sat back in the cheap hotel chair, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He had walked into the Hawthorne estate believing he was the master of the universe, a brilliant architect of his own destiny, ready to discard his brilliant wife for a shiny new toy. But as the roar of a 747 shook the windows of his dingy room, Preston finally understood the absolute truth. He wasn't an architect. He was just a demolition site, and Camille had simply handed him the dynamite. At 8 a.m. the following morning, Preston Sterling walked into the sleek, mahogany-paneled conference room of Vanguard and Pierce. He looked entirely diminished. The impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit he wore seemed to hang off his frame, as if he had aged a decade in a single night. Sitting across the long glass table was Margaret Sterling Hayes, Camille's lead attorney. She did not offer him a coffee. She did not offer him a seat. She simply slid a thick stack of finalized settlement documents across the polished glass, accompanied by a heavy, gold Mont Blanc pen. the exact same brand Preston had hastily packed into his cardboard box the day before. Preston didn't bother reading the clauses. He already knew the terms of his surrender. He picked up the pen and began to sign his name, the scratch of the nib echoing loudly in the silent room. With every signature, he legally severed himself from the $8 million Hawthorne estate, the Upper East Side penthouse, his share of their massive investment portfolio, and the life of untouchable luxury he had taken entirely for granted. He paused at the final page, the waiver of his right to contest the FinCEN suspicious activity report. "If I sign this," Preston said, his voice raspy and defeated, "the federal inquiry will remain an internal Treasury file, provided you comply fully with the financial separation," Margaret stated coldly, her gaze unblinking. "My client has no desire to see her family's name dragged through a federal tax evasion trial. You are buying your freedom, Mr. Sterling. I suggest you finalize the transaction." Preston swallowed hard, his pride completely broken. He signed the final line. "Excellent," Margaret said, pulling the documents back. "Your $14,000 will be unthawed by noon. Your Porsche must be surrendered to the dealership in Greenwich by Friday. Good luck, Mr. Sterling." 6 months later, the spectacular implosion of Preston Sterling was nothing more than a whispered, cautionary tale in the private equity circles of Manhattan. Preston was now living in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. He had managed to secure a mid-level consulting role at a regional logistics firm, a massive, humiliating downgrade from his senior partnership at Kensington, Ward and Associates. He took the PATH train to work every morning, surrounded by the very middle-class commuters he used to look down upon from the back seat of his chauffeur-driven town cars. Chloe had blocked his number the moment she stepped onto the Metro North train that fateful afternoon. He later saw on Instagram that she was dating a tech venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. She had moved on without skipping a beat, treating Preston as nothing more than a bad investment. But the final, most devastating blow didn't come from a courtroom or a bank statement. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening in the form of a magazine. Preston had stopped at a local bodega to buy a cheap bottle of wine. As he waited in line at the register, his eyes drifted to the glossy magazine rack. There, staring back at him from the cover of Architectural Digest, was Camille. She looked absolutely radiant. She was wearing a stunning emerald green gown, standing on the grand sweeping staircase of the Hawthorne estate. But the house behind her had changed. The gaudy, neoclassical stiffness Preston had loved was gone. Camille had entirely gutted and redesigned the interior, transforming it into a breathtaking, modern sanctuary of warm woods, natural light, and curated, museum-quality black art. The headline read, "The Master Builder: How Camille Montgomery Transformed the Hawthorne Estate into a Monument of Modern Philanthropy." Preston's hands trembled as he pulled the magazine from the rack and flipped to the feature article. The pages detailed her visionary redesign, but it was the final paragraph that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Camille hadn't just kept the mansion as a petty trophy. She had rezoned the massive 12,000-square-foot property. The sprawling south wing, the exact master suite Preston had arrogantly promised to his mistress, had been converted into the permanent headquarters for the Montgomery Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing fully funded scholarships and capital grants to young, minority women entering the fields of architecture and commercial real estate. Preston read a direct quote from Camille at the end of the article. "A house is just stone and glass until you give it a purpose," Camille told the interviewer. "I acquired this property under unexpected circumstances, but I believe that when someone tries to build a foundation on deceit, the only logical response is to tear it down, and build something that serves the future. We didn't just renovate a mansion, we corrected its history. Preston paid for the magazine with a crumpled $20 bill, leaving his wine on the counter. He walked out into the cold New Jersey rain, the glossy pages clutched in his hand. He finally understood the fatal flaw in his grand design. He had thought he was a master manipulator, playing a high-stakes game of chess against a wife he believed was too passive to notice. But Camille hadn't been playing chess. She was an architect. She had simply let Preston dig his own grave, and when it was deep enough, she poured the concrete. Preston's catastrophic downfall is a masterful reminder that arrogance is often the loudest in the room, but true power moves in absolute silence. He thought he could outsmart a woman who spent her entire life studying foundations, structures, and blind spots. In the end, Camille didn't just take her revenge, she legally, financially, and socially evicted him from his own life, turning his ultimate betrayal into her ultimate triumph. What did you think of Camille's calculated, icy revenge? Was it justified, or did she take it too far by weaponizing his finances? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were hooked by this story of betrayal, brilliant strategy, and ultimate karma, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a flawless revenge story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas and jaw-dropping twists. See you in the next story.